When we left Europe last time, Europe was crumbling, falling apart at the seams. Some people who were invading were the Huns. I know I've mentioned them, led by Attila the Hun. These people were from Central Asia, and these people from Central Asia have time and time again left Mongolia and headed other places, particularly the Huns, the Magyars, the Bulgars, the Turks, and the other group led by Genghis Khan, just simply called the Mongolians. These 5 or 6 times in history, they have just poured out of Mongolia in waves. And usually they've headed toward Europe, but sometimes they've headed south to China, and sometimes to India, and once to Russia. Anyway, this time the Huns came across Russia, and they were a threat to both Romans and Germans. Another group that came from Germany were the Vandals. From where we get the word vandalism. Now, the Vandals in 410 sacked Rome, and that was the first time Rome had been sacked in 800 years, since the Celts had done it back in the 400 BC at 410, and it really sent shockwaves throughout the Western world. Hey, the city of Rome has been sacked by a group of Vandals. And a lot of people were thinking this was a sign of God's judgment, and a lot of people blamed Christianity. St. Augustine wrote an article, wrote a lengthy treatise explaining that no, it wasn't the fault of Christianity. We don't know why this happened, but nevertheless, it did. They destroyed a lot of the Roman Empire. Then came 3 groups that went to England. The Angles, from which we get the word England, England or Angleland. The Saxons and the Jews. 3 Germanic peoples, and that's why the modern English language is considered a Germanic language, because a lot of these peoples were Germanic in origin. And of course today, if you're an English-speaking person, you will not understand German without training, and if you're a German-speaking person, you will not understand English. But at one time they spoke, apparently all spoke the same language. Then there were 2 groups of Goths. The Goths, there were the Ostrogoths. These were the Eastern, and the Visigoths. The Ostrogoths settled in Italy. The Visigoths settled in Spain. The Ostrogoths spoke a much different language, but what happened was the 2 cultures fused, and they formed a new language called the Italian language, and Latin died. Latin remained spoken among the more educated people, and it remained spoken among religious ceremonies. But otherwise, Latin died as a language. The church, with all due respects to the church, tried hard to keep it alive, but in spite of that, the common people did not speak it anymore, and it died. Anyway, the Ostrogoths took over much of Italy. Italy was divided into several small states. There was the kingdom of Naples, the kingdom of Genoa, don't worry about these, the kingdom of Venus, and the Papal States, the kingdom of Pisa for a while. Many numerous states, the kingdom of Sicily, that Italy divided itself up into, and Italy was to remain divided until the year 1870, when they finally were united again. That we talked about in second semester world history. The Roman Empire appeared to the Romans to still be intact because the Roman people were still under Roman officials, but for all practical purposes the Roman Empire was dead. But there were debate at the time, is the Roman Empire dead or merely dormant? Both Romans and Ostrogoths eventually fused, and they both disappeared as an ethnic group. So the people in Italy today are known as Italians. Now the Visigoths, when they took over Spain, they remained scattered and disunited, and they were ripe targets for Islam, which came in around the year 700, and they took over part of Spain, and Spain was to spend the next 800 years trying to drive them out. Spain finally did drive them out, and the year was 1492. The same year that once they were driven out, Queen Isabella felt confident enough with her finances to give Columbus 3 of her ships to sail west. They were old, dilapidated ships that were in bad need of repair, but Columbus knew how to handle them. Now, before these Germanic peoples came to Britain, there were the people living in Britain were called the Britons. That's where we get the name Britain. The Britons were eventually driven out of England, and some of them moved to Wales, which is here in the western part of Britain, and some of them moved to Brittany, which is along this peninsula. But the Britons were driven out of England except for being sent to Wales and to Brittany. But for 40 years, and this is in the records, the invasions by the Germanic tribes was stopped. Who stopped them and how? Legend says that the person who stopped them was the great King Arthur. I was talking to one of my fellow faculty about this earlier today, and I asked how many of you have read any stories about King Arthur by any chance? About the same response I got in the other class, about 3 or 4 of you. And regrettably, anyway, King Arthur, all right, most famous king Britain ever had, if he existed at all. Now that's the question. Now, according to British folklore, I'll start the story with Merlin. All right, folks, again, I'm not asking you to believe this. This is the way that they told it. Now, these stories were told before the invention of radio, before the invention of television, before, all right, the church had outlawed plays to be performed on stage. So people then would gather around and tell stories. So you might ask, why they outlaw plays? The church believed, and a lot of people know this to be true, that a lot of the personal lives of your actors and actresses leave a whole lot to be desired. And this has been true all the way down through the ages. I mean, the man who shot Abraham Lincoln, what was his profession? Anybody know he was an actor? He was an actor. Yeah, the man who shot Lincoln was an actor. And of course, I could name some actors and actresses whose personal lives left a whole lot to be desired. And they frequently die of drug overdoses or some other untimely death. They die young oftentimes. Elvis Presley, for one. All right, I'll make that. But, anyway, so the church, so these people would gather around these stories, and we gather around campfires, or minstrels would go around and collect an audience and tell stories like this. Now, the story of Arthur begins somewhat like this. That there was a woman who became pregnant by a fallen angel, and this is as far as one of the last time in history that this story is told. And Satan thought, hey, I've got my man now, the person who's born will be my Antichrist. But this woman instead starting attending church regularly, going to confession every day and attending mass every day. And so when the baby was born, named Merlin, Merlin instead became a Christian, but he was part angel and part man, so he had some divine powers. He had some abilities that ordinary people do not have. And one of his abilities, well, one day, when Arthur had a son, an illegitimate son named Arthur, Merlin said to Arthur, you'll never rear up this boy. In short order, Arthur Pendragon died. And Merlin stole the baby from the palace and took him to the house of Sir Ector and said, now, you don't know who this baby is, but rear up this baby and I'll send for it when the time is right. Then Merlin wedged a sword in a stone, placed the sword in the churchyard and said, whoever can pull this sword is the rightful heir to the throne of England. Well, 15 years went by. Many a strong man tried to pull the sword and nobody could. 15 years later, a party was going on. And young Arthur went to the party. This was a big event, a party. It was something to break the routine. Well, he got the party, and they learned that Arthur's older brother, who had just been knighted, had forgotten his sword, and this was a disgrace. So the Sir Rector said to Arthur, Arthur, go home and fetch your brother's sword and don't tell anyone a word about this, because we don't want anyone to know that your brother forgot his sword. So Arthur thought, oh, it's just my luck. I have to be the one that, my brother's the one who forgot the sword, but nevertheless, the father's word. Okay, so Arthur was just going, hey, there's a sword wedged in a stone in the churchyard right here nearby. And by the way, I've heard anything that's in the churchyard belongs to the whole community, and as long as I put it back, who'll notice it missing? So he went to church, pulled the sword out of the stone. Then, you know, the safe way to carry a sword is to raise it high in the air. He didn't have a sheath, so he put his sword high in the air and ran pell-mell back to the party. And he broke into the clearing where the party was. He didn't notice that everybody who saw him stopped what they were doing, grabbed everybody's attention. Everybody started following him. He was running pell-mell as fast as a 15-year-old could. I mean, I recall I once had that kind of energy myself. I don't know where it went. But anyway, he didn't notice anything was wrong until he got to where his family was, when his father said, son, where did you get this? I promised I'll put it back. Nobody was, son, did you pull the sword out of the stone in the churchyard? At this point, Arthur became aware that the whole congregation, the whole crowd, high-born and low-born alike, whatever he had done, he had all of a sudden become the center of everybody's attention. Well, some of the high-up men got together, got their heads together, said, let's go back to the churchyard. Went back there, wedged the sword back in the stone. Several of the men, strong men, tried to pull it out. None of them could. They asked Arthur to pull it out. Everybody watched. Arthur pulled it out easily with one hand. After a while, they did this experiment over and over. After a while, they said, this is a real work of magic, and England has found its long-lost king. So Sir Rector, the father, took young Arthur and said, listen, I got something to tell you. I'm not really your father. I was told not to tell you this, but I'm not your father. And Arthur said, well, who is? Well, apparently your father was the former king, King Uther Pendragon. Well, they began to prepare for a coronation for Arthur and move him into the palace. And that led to stories that's told down through the generations of Arthur, his Knights of Round Table, his wife, Lady Guinevere, and Sir Lancelot's crush on Guinevere. This crush of Sir Lancelot on Guinevere wound up destroying Arthur's entire army and led to the death of Arthur himself. And led to the Germans being able to come back in. But according to the story, Arthur fought off the Germans and held at bay for some 40 years. We do not know how to. We do know that the Germans were stopped for about 40 years. Now, when I read a book about this when I was in high school, the author said, any modern youth will ask, how much of this story can I believe? This book was written in the 1950s, and of course, in the 1950s, all stories that involved magic had to have some kind of a rational, natural explanation. Today, we have all kinds of stories of magic and super deeds that do not have natural explanations, but in those days, they felt like they had to put natural explanations. Now, as to how much of this you can believe, again, folk, depends on your worldview. This generation, I believe, is more prone or more apt to accept stories of the supernatural than my generation was. Be that as it may. All right. Now, another group of people who moved in were the Franks. From the word Franks, we get the French. The word French is a European word that basically means free, the free people. The Franks were at first a bunch of small independent chieftains ruled by what might be called a chief, until King Clovis united all of the Franks into one country. And mostly the country conquered is, for the most part, the boundaries of France today. I mean, these boundaries have undergone some changes down through the last 1,600 or so years. Now, Clovis was a member of the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingian dynasty has made a lot of news in recent years. There's a book out, Holy Cross, Holy Grail, about the Merovingian dynasty, and there's also a book out with movies was made recently by a man named Dan Brown about the Merovingian dynasty. If you're into alternate history or into conspiracy theories, some people go so far as to say that a lot of Europe's wars have been attempts to restore the Merovingian dynasty, and the most recent was World War I. World War I was the last serious attempt, according to them, to restore the Merovingian dynasty. Well, what's so great about the Merovingians? The word Merovingian, according to them, it comes from the name Mary Magdalene, and according to their account, the folk, I don't believe it, but nevertheless, I feel like I ought to, because you're likely to run into this in the real world, so I'm going to talk about it now. According to them, Mary Magdalene married either Jesus or one of Jesus' brothers, particularly likely James, and then together they founded this dynasty that was destined to rule. The Merovingians are known to have believed that they were descendants from David. Of course, if you know anything about the biblical story, Jesus and his brothers were descended from King David and their son Solomon. So they spent a lot of time reading the Psalms and the Proverbs because they believed that their ancestor David, that David was there and he had written a lot of the Psalms and the Proverbs. And so they spent a lot of time in contemplating and studying. But they had another super big problem. A problem that a lot of rulers have had down through the ages. The Merovingians were seriously inbred. That is, every Merovingian king would only marry into his own family and usually marry his first cousin. Second cousin was about as far as you go, so that meant that the idea was to try to keep the genes, you might say, pure. In other words, only their genes would be in the gene pool. And the result was they did not realize that every human being carries a bunch of recessive mutations that are usually harmful, but they're recessive. That means that they don't express themselves unless you marry someone who's close to kin who has the same genes you do, bad genes that you do. And the result is, if you keep inbreeding, you're going to get what happened to the Merovingian dynasty? A typical Merovingian king only lived about 22 or so years. He'd be born to a father who was a teenager, who was king. At the age of 6, his father would die. I'm talking about the lifestyle of a typical Merovingian. Then he'd be married at about 15 himself. At about 20 or so, he'd die and pass on the throne to a 5 or 6-year-old son, and the cycle would go on. Clovis, now, of course, was lived before these events happened. But anyway, they believed that they were destined to rule all of Europe. And a lot of their followers have believed the same thing. And this led to numerous wars throughout European history. Some of them were believed to be attempts by persons who believed the Merovingians were the rightful heirs to the throne to restore the Merovingian dynasty. Now, Clovis is, remember, no boast that fall, because he was the first Roman Catholic Christian first Roman Catholic king of Europe. You might say, well, I thought that the emperors were all Christian, but they were Christian of the Arian branch of Catholicism. Today, Arianism hardly exists anymore, but basically the Arians followed the teachings of Arius. And there was a huge difference between Arianism and Roman Catholicism, and that difference was Arius believed that Jesus was just an exalted man, but not divine. Roman Catholicism taught that Jesus was fully divine, fully God, and fully man. Roman Catholic theology won out, and Arianism, for all practical purposes, has died. But see, these other kings, including Constantine and the other Roman emperors, were converts to the Arian faith, and the Arian faith was very strong here in this part of the world. And you might know that this is a part of the world that was taken over by Islam later. And a lot of persons believe, and I don't know how much this I should say, but I'm going to say it anyway. A lot of persons believe that one of the reasons why that Islam was able to conquer this part of the world was that these people believed that Jesus was only an exalted prophet, and that way it left room for another prophet. On the other hand, Western Europeans believed that Jesus was fully God, that left room for no other. Again, you can take that for what it's worth, but Islam, of course, was not able to to conquer this part of the world, but it did conquer this. How much theology had to do with it, that's pure speculation. You can decide for yourself. But anyway, Clovis was the first fully Roman Catholic king, and his conversion helped to guarantee that eventually all the kings of Europe would convert to Roman Catholicism, and that Europe then was to become a Christian continent, as opposed to others. Now, one of the things that did not happen, I mean, there have been books written that if Europe were to send its princes to try to talk to the Chinese princes, Chinese royalty and Indian royalty and Japanese royalty, if Europe had sent its high-born princes as missionaries to try to talk to convert the highborns that other places in the world might have converted to Christianity, that's one of these things we can only speculate on. As it was, what actually happened, Europe only sent its poor and downtrodden priests into these parts of the world, with the result that they made a lot of headway converting poor people, lower class, but did not convert the kings, whereas Europe converted its kings. Now, why did Clovis convert? Simply this: he could see the political winds blowing. His wife was a Christian. Most of the generals in his army were Christian. His prime minister was a Christian. His empire was converting really, by this time his empire was converting fast to Christianity. Christianity was taking over, and he saw the political winds blowing in that direction. So you might say he got on a bandwagon and joined. And yes?
So are you using Christian very loosely? Because Catholic and Christian is kind of...
I'm using it the way that history books use it, the way the historian do. He converted to Christian, and he claimed he was a Christian. I mean, he went to the priest, and he knelt down to the priest. He was baptized, sprinkled, in other words. But that was the way that the Catholic Church was doing it at that time. So he was Christian in that he joined the church. Okay. Now, I know if you're a Southern Baptist, you might say, well, was he really genuinely converted? And my wife asked me one time, was Constantine genuinely converted? I said, in preparation for master's exam, I had to read 25 books, and one of them dealt with just that subject, called The Conversion of Constantine. This author said Constantine's conversion was genuine. Yeah, he had a few lapses, but basically genuine. Was Clovis's conversion genuine? Well, he remained true to it till the day he died. It did not make him a mild-mannered man and turn the other cheek. He led his armies with more fervor than before. He conquered like crazy. Yeah.
I just mean like Roman Catholic Christians, like kind of opposite Catholic and Christian. Or...
Keep in mind, in the 400s, there was only one unit church. I mean, all right, I have spent a lot of my time thinking of if I had been able to live for the last 2,000 years, at what point would I have, or what difference could I have made? Okay, basically what I'm asking myself is, at what point would I have left and formed my own church? But leaving that alone, and that's a hot subject to say the least. Nevertheless, in the 400s, there was only one church. There were different branches, but basically one church, and the priests were taking over, and they were everywhere they found a Christian group, they were running in and say, we're from Rome and we're a priest. So basically, there was only one church you could convert to. Now, in the Far East here, there was Arianism, and eventually we're going to learn where the East and West split over several doctrinal differences, but the East and West, but at this time, there was only one. Anyway, when Clovis died, he passed the kingdom on to a bunch of, a succession of weak sons. The one of the Merovingian kings after him did amount to a little bit, it lived to be about 30. The rest of them all were physical and mentally feeble. And again, the problem was they were inbred. All right, leaving the political history for a while, what was life like for the ordinary German? All right, if you had lived at this time in Germany, you would have been part of a family. And the family meant not only just your father and mother, but your cousins and second and third and fourth cousins extended. Basically a tribe. So your immediate family and your extended family played a big role in your life. Now, under the Roman times, The Romans had a system of justice where that if you committed a crime, it was up to the state to mete out vengeance. But under paganism, vengeance was a big part of the paganistic lifestyle. So if some member of some other family hurt you, you could expect your family's going to rise up and strike back and hurt some member of their family. This was to lead to feuds that went on between families for generations. The most famous one being the feud between the Montagues and Capulets, the story of Romeo and Juliet. Did anyone have to read that when you were in high school? Yeah. After a couple hundred years, these families were feuding and didn't even know what the original feud had been about. In our own history, the most famous family feud was between the Hatfields and McCoys that occurred down in Virginia and North Carolina. And it wound up getting several of them killed. But today, the Hatfields and McCoys meet once a year to have a big party together, all they've made up. And they'll reminisce of the past that I don't think any of them knows what actually started the feud. In the Scottish folklore, there was a big feud that went on between the Cunninghams and the Montgomerys. And the Cunninghams would rise up and kill a few Montgomerys, and the Montgomerys would rise up and waylay and ambush and kill a few Cunninghams. And the king was powerless to stop it. This went back and forth for, I guess, more than 100 years. The Cunninghams and the Kennedys did not get along either. This is some personal history, folk. But anyway, leaving that, this led to a lot of family feuds. The Romans had a system of justice where if you committed a crime, it was a matter for the state, not a matter for the family. Now, folk, we consider our way of living more civilized. But I will say, as crime in this country gets worse and worse and worse, and more criminals get off scot-free, there have been calls for return to the old justice system where a family member of the person injured would be the first person to strike a blow at the person who injured them. There have been calls for this. They're saying that in the days of the Germans where the families took over and made vengeance, it actually made a person more afraid to hurt a member of another family. Leaving that, eventually the Germans worked out a system where a weregild, again a foreign word, the weregild replaced the system of justice. The basic word for weregild is like a fine. You pay a fine. In other words, instead of if somebody cripples a member of your family, you take the matter before a judge fines the offending family against the offended. And this takes the place of revenge. Now, there's another term that they used, you run into if you study German history, compurgation. This is where the accused would get a whole lot of people, as many as he could, to swear an oath that this person is innocent. I was with this person at the time, and if he could get enough people to swear to his innocence, he could get off. Now, unless you could get a whole bunch of persons to swear to his guilt, then he might not get off. But if he could get enough people to swear to his innocence who knew about the crime, he could get off. Remind me of a story I heard. One person said, Your Honor, I can produce 50 reliable witnesses who didn't see me do it. And the judge said, no, but we've got 2 reliable witnesses who did see you do it. You're guilty. Never mind the persons who didn't see them. But anyway. Now, another one, this may sound strange to us at first, ordeal. This is where the accused was asked to walk on a bed of hot coals, or to walk on a hot iron, that had been heated up, or to lie down on a bed of spikes, with the idea being that if he were innocent, he'd heal quickly. Now, this may not be as far-fetched as it sounds, folks, because a lot of doctors will tell you that guilt will make a person not heal as fast as an innocent person will. That guilt, of course, a lot of guilt will eventually lead to a person becoming sick, dying young, developing cancers, tumors, and all kinds of problems. Now, I'm not saying everyone who has cancer is laden down with guilt, but in a lot of cases, guilt seems to bring on cancers, health problems, and in general, other things being equal, an innocent person who walks on a bed of hot coals will likely heal faster than a guilty person. Again, all other things being equal. Now, the nearest thing we have today is a lie detector. Lie detectors are no longer admissible for guilt innocence court, even though they are still used in court cases. Basically, the idea behind a lie detector is you ask a lot of questions with a blood pressure gadget strapped to you, and if you're asked about something you don't want to talk about, your blood pressure is going to rise. Now, there's a problem with this. Some people lie so much and live a lie so much that they can lie without their blood pressure rising. It's also known if you put a tack in your foot and you press against the tack when you ask the wrong kind of question, this tack can make pain, can make your blood pressure go down. This is something I heard this morning. It is known also that if you do deprive yourself of sleep for 40 or 50 hours before the test, your body will be too weak for your blood pressure to rise. You won't care anymore, so they can ask you anything they want. There are ways to fool the test, folks. And also some people who are genuinely nervous all the time will have a blood pressure rise just because they're afraid of, I'm afraid he's going to think I'm lying anyway, so they'll, even when they're telling the truth, their blood pressure will rise. Nevertheless, I can name a man who worked with me at Lockheed back in 1997 who went to prison for 2 years. And what set the case against him was the results of a polygraph test. Lie detector, another name for lie detector. It wasn't enough to convict by himself, but nevertheless, it turned the case against him. Did he do what they accused him of? I think he likely did. And the lie detector showed it. Anyway, so it's still around and it's still used. And in most cases it is right, but it's not foolproof. All right, anybody have any comments? Okay, moving on. Christianity. I had a student ask me some years ago, how did the Pope become so powerful? Essentially, you have to get someone like the Pope, and the Western Pope is unique to the world. There's been no one like him throughout history. You have to have a political unity, and then the political unity has to disintegrate, but the Pope was left. Essentially, the Pope wound up taking over functions that once been done by the state. The Pope wound up performing marriage ceremonies, setting up courts, settling disputes, probating wills, seeing that the right person's got the right estate when the owner of the estate died, seeing that the deceased wishes were carried out. They took over these functions. As the state became more and more powerless, the Pope was the one strong man of the hour. The church organized itself along the way that the state had been. I mean, our churches do the same thing. You have an Alabama church and a Georgia church and a Mississippi church with a lot of denominations organize themselves along political lines. Well, the churches in Rome did the same thing. Started off at the bottom, you had the parish priest. Above the priest was the bishop. And then above the bishop, eventually became the office of archbishop. Now later you had the office of cardinal, and then eventually the office of pope. Originally the pope was nothing more than Bishop of Rome. And our present pope, on the day he took office, he said, I'm not going to forget that first and foremost, I'm Bishop of Rome. Most of you probably would not have paid attention to that. I would, because I've studied the papacy. And my brother-in-law has 2 books about the papacy from the very beginning until the day the book was written. The first 400 years, the popes were nothing more than bishops of Rome. And it is known that several of them were married, and more than one of them, when he died, passed the bishopric on to his son. The idea that the bishops should be celibate, the priests should be celibate, that was to come sometime after the year 400. But what helped greatly enhance the power of the Pope, well, number one was the political disintegration of Europe. And then number 2, one of the popes, Pope Leo, went to Attila the Hun and persuaded Attila not to attack Rome. Now, Attila had been defeated by a certain general when he was defeated when the Romans and Germans combined their armies and defeated him. Nevertheless, after his defeat, Attila went down here into Italy, and he was passing by Rome on his way out of Italy, because he had learned that this general who had defeated him was on his way to Italy, and also the Roman emperor was come from the old Roman emperor was right over here across the Adriatic, so he had all kinds of reasons to leave. And also, somebody has pointed out that Attila was afraid that if winter set in and found him in Italy, his troops would be caught in the cold and catch all kinds of diseases. So he had every reason to leave. Nevertheless, it is known that Pope Leo went out and talked to Attila, but Attila had probably already made up his mind to leave anyway, so Attila did not attack Rome, and this greatly enhanced the prestige of the Pope. Now, there's a story I got up, which I want to tell you up front, I don't believe it. St. Peter and St. Paul appeared with flaming swords, and they waved them at Attila, and all that the trembling Attila could do was, they said, we're going to burn you up if you don't do what the Pope says. And all the trembling Attila could do was simply up and leave. No, not to not believe that, but nevertheless, this story did get out. But nevertheless, when the Pope Leo persuaded Attila not to attack Rome, this greatly enhanced the prestige of the Pope. So more and more the bishops began to assert the power that had been once belonged to Roman magistrates. The greatest pope of this period was Pope Gregory, otherwise known as Gregory the Great. It has been said, even by people who are anti-Catholic, that if all the popes had been like Gregory the Great, there would be no Protestants today. There would never have been a Protestant Reformation, and all of us would still be Catholic. Be that as it may, Pope Gregory, among his other good deeds, he helped the poor. Now, I've said, you've heard me say that the state has no business helping the poor. However, that does not apply to the church. Pope Gregory was, after all, a church man, and I have to commend him for helping the poor. He sent missionaries far off to try to convert the rest of Europeans who were still not converted. But in addition, he gave us the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar is expected to last 10,000 years before at some point, 10,000 years down the road, we have to add or subtract a day. The Gregorian calendar has been used by Europeans now for almost 1,500 years, and we're still on target with our equinox and solstices. After 500 years, about 550 or 600 years, found that the Julian calendar, set by Julius Caesar, was wrong. And it was losing about 3 days every century. Well, that may not sound like much, but after 5 centuries, it had lost 15 days. And they realized if we don't correct the calendar, we're going to wind up singing I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas when the temperature outside would be 100 degrees. Because the seasons, the months would have moved from winter to summer and summer to winter. But the Gregorian calendar keeps the equinoxes and the solstices occurring approximately the same day every year. So for the next 10,000 years, spring will occur approximately March 21st, and summer approximately June 21st. And winter solstice will occur approximately December 21st. I say approximately, these dates will vary by 1 day either way. Now the fall equinox occurs on September 22nd and will for the next 100 years. But anyway, he set up the Gregorian calendar. He also organized the Papal States, and the Papal States were like another independent country in Rome, along with the Kingdom of Venus, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Genoa, the Kingdom of Sicily, the Kingdom of Sardinia. I mean, he set up the Papal States, and the Papal States became a nation headed by the Pope. They signed treaties, they fielded armies, so that the Pope became a European monarch, basically, and a lot of people believe this is wrong. Anyway, the Papal States were to last until 1870, when Italy united and forced the papacy into occupy one small area of the Vatican, but that was to come later. But the popes were to have what's called temporal power, or a worldly kingdom, here on earth for the next more than 1,000 years. Now, he set up numerous monasteries, and I want to elaborate on the monasteries a little bit. The monasteries is where the monks lived. The convent was where the nuns lived. Monks were the males, of course, and the convent were the females. These people made a vow, and I recall I thought this would be easy to remember, and it came down to for a test, I missed it. It was one of those fill-in-the-blank tests, and I was used to studying for a multiple-choice test. If it had been a multiple-choice test, I know it, but they vowed 3 things, both the monks and the nuns. They vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience. It has been said that what you miss on a test is the thing you're going to most likely remember the rest of your life. Poverty means we will not own anything. Anything we have will be owned by the monastery, and we have no private property. Chastity, we will never engage in any kind of sex. We will never marry. Obedience, we will always obey our abbot, if you're a monk, or mother superior if you're a nun. The monasteries were a lot like the libraries, the hospitals, the community centers, the colleges, the schools, all rolled into one. These monks did a lot to keep the knowledge of the ancient world alive. They were constantly busy. I mean, they grew gardens, they helped the poor, they helped the sick. I mean, the monasteries were somewhat, you might say, like an old folks' home to some extent, or like a hospice. They would take care of the persons in their last time when the family simply was too busy to take care of them. But they copied any manuscript they get their hands on. Of course, they copied the Bible. They also copied the works of Cicero, of Plato, of Aristotle, Tacitus, Ovid, and all these philosophers from ancient times and historians from ancient times. And well, the reason we know more about what happened in Greece and Rome today is because the monks kept them alive. And we have to wonder what was going on in Albania, what was going on in Romania during this time. Folk, there were people there. We do not know much about it. Who were the leaders? We don't know. Who were the philosophers? Who were the religious? We don't know. But we do know a lot about Greece and Rome, owing to the fact that the monks copied their works down and preserved it throughout the period of time that we otherwise call the Dark Ages. I mean, this period of time in history has been called the Dark Ages. The monks at first were solitary hermits. They would live alone in the desert, but then they got together and decided they could do more good serving the community. So they would serve again as the hospitals, libraries, community centers, schools, colleges, all rolled into one. All right. Charlemagne. Before we get to Charlemagne, the last Merovingian, well, back to Charles, back up a little bit. As the Merovingian kings became weaker and weaker, their duties were turned over to the mayor of the palace. In other words, the word mayor, if any of you study for means big man. The big man in the palace. Charles Martel was the mayor of the palace, and he is remembered for winning the Battle of Tours that stopped the Muslim advance contained into where it was. Now, Tours is a city that's somewhat located between France and Spain, or close to both of them. I don't know which one it's actually in. But anyway, the Battle of Tours, I think it's in France. Anyway, stopped the Muslim advance into Europe. And Charles was given credit for it. Charles had a son named Pepin. Pepin decided it was time to end the sham of Merovingian rule. So Pepin wrote a letter to the Pope saying, in effect, I think I should be king because the kings aren't doing anything. The Pope sided with Pepin. The people then put the last Merovingian in a monastery, basically put him on a shelf. And Pepin became the king. So Pepin was the first king of the dynasty called the Carolingian dynasty. Named after Charles Martel, the Carolingians. You know, the dynasty of Charles. Anyway, Pepin, when he died, he had a son named Charlemagne. which means Charles the Great. This word Martel, by the way, means hammer. He's Charles the Hammer. Pepin, Pepin the Short. The French began to give all their kings names, and some of them get names that were not very complimentary. I mean, Pepin the Short, that's not necessarily the best name you could call a good king, but Charlemagne, this means Charles the Great. Some of the later Charleses were called Charles the Fat, Charles the Bald, and yes, catch this, Charles the Simple. Anyway, they lost the names of the Hammer or the Great. But anyway, Charlemagne, he was the greatest figure of the Middle Ages. He built up an empire that included all of what is today France, Germany, Switzerland, and northern Italy, and Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The biggest empire that they had up to that time, much bigger than Clovis's. Charlemagne, because his empire was large, depended on his counts. But then Charlemagne did something else, remember him for. He got noticing that he would give a verbal order to a page and say, you go tell Count so-and-so to do thus and such. By the time that order got the count, there was no telling what the page would wind up saying. The page would get mixed up, forget, and this happened more than once, where the page would pass it on to another page, you would pass it on to another page, you pass it on to another page, by the time it got to the nobleman that Charlemagne intended for. So Charlemagne realized, I've got to teach my people to read, and I've got to give them written orders. And again, if you work at a large factory like I did, they'll have what's called an ANVO, and the word ANVO means accept no verbal orders. Because verbal orders can easily be misinterpreted. Write down what you want done, write down, and we were not allowed to do any work unless it was paperwork, and not even make a wire unless we had paperwork to justify why are we making up this wire with its lugs on each end. Because the paperwork told us how the company wanted that wire made up, what numbers they wanted stamped on it, whatever. But anyway, all parts that were made had to have paperwork, and the paperwork followed apart all the way up the assembly line. Then eventually the paperwork was stored in this room, maybe this size, and it would contain numerous file cabinets that would stay with, be part of the plane for as long as the plane flew, maybe 30 or 40 years. But anyway, Charlemagne then set up a school. This school was only for the sons of the noblemen who were going to be nobles someday, but it was the first state-sponsored school we know of in Europe. And a lot of people say this was the beginning of free public education. Or basically, Charlemagne said, you send your sons to my school, you noble people, send your sons to my school. I will see that they're educated, and at some point they'll be returned back to you, knowing how to read and write. Charlemagne himself, believe it or not, even though he was the son of the King Pepin, he could neither read nor write. Neither could Pepin, neither could Charles Martel. But Charlemagne said, from now on, my nobles are going to learn how to read or write, and after him, the other kings after him, all were educated. This was the beginning of what was to become, or believed to be the beginning of what was to become public education. Now, I'll say one more thing about Charlemagne, and I'll close. In the year 800, Charlemagne was down here in Rome at Christmas time, and the Pope said, sir, I want you to kneel down. Well, Charlemagne complied, he kneeled, and the Pope slipped a crown on his head without Charlemagne, and said, rise up, Roman Emperor. Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans. It was the first time a non-Roman had been crowned Roman Emperor. It was the church's, another one of many attempts the church made to try to revive the Roman Empire. Was Charlemagne truly Roman Emperor? Well, you can decide that for yourself. But this was the beginning of the title of Holy Roman Empire, which was to last from the year 800 to 1802 when Napoleon Bonaparte abolished it. It was to last 1,000 years. But again, it was all an attempt of the church to make the Roman Empire come back to life. For all practical purposes, it never did. The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Well, I read a book one time where this man who wrote the book had a different take on it. He said, in his dream, he saw the Holy Roman Emperor. He said he didn't look holy, and he certainly wasn't Roman, but he was an emperor. You couldn't deny that. You could tell it by the way he was dressed. He was an emperor. Anyway, leaving that, Charlemagne goes down as being perhaps the first of the Holy Roman Emperors, and this title was to last in Europe. So throughout the rest of the semester, we're talking about Holy Roman Emperor this, Holy Roman Emperor that. They were a big part of European politics for the next 1,000 years. Everybody have a good weekend. Don't stay up till midnight doing your papers. They're not due unless you want extra credit for it. And I will see you on Monday.